Thank you for a very comprehensive overview of a fascinating study. I would like to now invite our colleague, Professor Monty Marshall, to start questioning on behalf of the committee, followed in by Professor Solon Simmons, and then myself. Monty.
Okay. Well, I sympathize with you for taking on a task so large and complex that you open yourself up to not only an obligation to look at everything, but also a vulnerability to defend yourself against everything. It's not an easy position to be in, and obviously the challenge is tremendous, but your courage in taking on such a project is commendable, if not, well, anyway.
Foolish.
Yeah, foolish. Thank you. No, that's not exactly the word that I was thinking of, but it's probably a better one than the one I was thinking of. Had I advised you from the beginning, I would have probably steered you away from such an endeavor, but as you had already decided on your trajectory, I did what I could to point out things that you should at least consider. My question then is as complex as my introduction. But you talk about interventions and placing social conflicts in context, in their effective context, and we've done a lot of work in trying to do this, and it's very difficult to gauge just what the source of influences are, what their effects are. And of course we have always the problem with counterfactuals, that only one thing ever happens. And it's always just the one thing that does happen is always justified over what could have happened had we not done the one thing that we actually did. And there's no way to check that, except if you broaden the scope and look at other situations that are similar with different conditions and different treatments to see if indeed that rationalization holds muster. So, with the topic of interventions, there are several justifications. You talk about national interest as being one, and it's a realist perspective, that nations are only willing to intervene when their national interests are threatened. There are other justifications, humanitarian interests, which would be altruistic, and they relate to the R2P, emerging R2P normative argument. Another would be to manage the global order, which one might relate to an idealistic motivation. And then there's an unsung motivation. All three of these have a rational basis, but there's another one, an emotive response of indignation. The countries get involved not because they're pursuing a rational goal, but because they're acting out and somehow justifying themselves vis-a-vis the other. Well, there are different ways to test the veracity or the effect of the intervention. For the realistic, to see if conditions improve on the basis of the intervention. And I think you have gone a long way to arguing that no, they don't. They actually get worse. From a humanitarian point of view, you can use a similar argument. The effect on the target, does it improve their circumstances or make them worse? Of course, from the realistic, you have to include the other, the intervener. Is there a cost effectiveness to intervening? Do they get what they want for the amount of investment? From the global order, on the other hand, you have to look at and see if what has happened at this point changes the circumstances and leads to a more effective order in the future. From the emotive point of view, there's really no justifiable outcome, that any outcome is just an outgrowth of the actions that took place. Now, you have argued or talked about the effect on the target, but the target rarely is involved in the decision to intervene directly in any case. They might say they are indirectly involved by not being able to handle something that really threatens someone else. But is there an argument that you could make or strengthen in your dissertation to show that it's also irrational for the intervener to become involved in these, if you, of course, control for whatever emotive benefit that they get?
I think this is a very good question, and certainly one I should have looked at, especially when considering that my audience is I'm really addressing the policy community. So whereas I've given a very ethical argument, made an ethical argument for non-intervention, I think you're absolutely right in suggesting that I should have looked at the costs for the perpetrator, the interveners, and the war costs, for instance. And I mentioned the study by Brown University, which was released last month, conducted by 20 academics, which suggests that the United States war costs during the last 10 years, ever since in the wake of 9/11, and the projected war costs up to 2020 are likely to go up to $4.4 trillion, which is a tremendous cost for the United States, given the dire economic environment. So I think certainly this is something that I should look at in making my argument stronger. It's very important for the United States not to consider, to engage in a cost-benefit analysis. How has a war effort or intervention contributed to the betterment or to strengthening its own interests? Certainly one could argue, and many have argued, that the homeland is more secure as a result of the interventions in Afghanistan and Iraq. But at the same time, the financial costs have been immense, and that's something I would like to look at when I work on another project related to this.
Any follow-up questions, Monty?
Not at this time.
Okay, thank you. So,
Thank you. It's wonderful, Saira, to be here and to have the opportunity to provide a few thoughts and to watch what you've had to say. I think that I would encourage the audience to look at the dissertation, because it's actually a difficult dissertation to present in a single in a presentation like this, because I even having been through it a number of times, I think to myself, what is it ultimately about? Because on some level, I think the dissertation is about state failure, as you introduced, and I like that you've gone ahead and suggested why this is interesting to you and why it was. In another way, it can be about military intervention, as Monty's question pointed to. In another way, it's a deeper meditation on the Hobbesian problem of order. And I think that, in a sense, that doesn't come through as much as it might, because Saira grounds the dissertation, she didn't present it here, in a very rich theoretical and philosophical tradition. I mean, she really goes back through the Western trajectory of thinking about the state, and in a way that makes us raise very fundamental questions. The first thing I wanted to say in that respect is that I wanted to read a piece from the dissertation that I think highlights something that should be brought out. And that it's the idea that what you're suggesting and what makes it a conflict resolution dissertation is that it's not that the problem, let's say the problem here, is not the problem of the security apparatus not being developed enough, but instead grievances that have not been addressed. And you say in this context, the denial of civil rights to the African American community until the mid-60s attests to the flaws in state institutions. Despite the ideals enshrined in the Bill of Rights, the civil rights movement in the chaotic period in not distant American history demonstrating that high-intensity civil unrest may be symptomatic of a crisis, but not necessarily failure. Failure is often suggested in Western scholarship on state failure. So I think that, that this is more of a comment than a question. But I think that it's very important to highlight the fact that you're suggesting that in fact it might not be, irrespective of what military intervention might accomplish. What you're suggesting is that instead we should not only be worried about the strength of the state. We shouldn't be necessarily only trying to increase the police powers in these places which are a threat to us, but instead ought to be strengthening civil society and the ability to address grievances. And putting that kind of a frame on the thing might prevent you from some of the considerations of being involved in saying, well, should we or should we not be involved in military interventions, which is another big question, an important one. Now, here's a real question. The question is, since it's a meditation on Western philosophy, you propose two potentially different ways of thinking about what kind of problem in Western philosophy might be there. And I put them under implementation and conceptualization. And the implementation problem that I read in your dissertation is that the foreign policy of the United States and other places like it are really more about Western security than they are about the Western model itself. And that's related to the conceptualization problem, which is that it's really the normative Western model that's a problem. And so I have a question of, do you think that there's some kind of fundamentally problematic way that the United States and the international community address these parts of the world which we call failing, which are, as you say, these weak states which we paint as the worst threat? Is there something about the normative model that's being imposed, or is it simply a failure to implement that model to live up to those concerns, because the West is really only concerned about its own security threats? So I suppose that's a question.
Well, I don't think there is anything wrong with the Western normative model of the state, but I feel that when that the West has a tendency to impose its own standards on the third world, for instance, and while I think the third world, the developing world, would benefit immensely from democratic forces of change. As Muhammad Ayub has argued, and I've discussed him in my dissertation, often it takes centuries for democracies to evolve, as we've witnessed in the case of Western Europe. Even in the United States, up until the 1960s, as you quoted from my dissertation, African Americans did not have the right of franchise. So it takes time. There's nothing wrong with trying to introduce these values to the third world, but the third world has to be ready for them, and it has to come from within rather than being imposed from the outside. Institution building must be a locally driven process. The West certainly provides models that one can emulate, but the willingness to emulate them and to modify them according to local to modify them according to the local context should be an option for the third world. So does that answer your question?
It makes sense. So if you were to say, is it mainly a problem of conceptualization or implementation, would you say, because it seems to me the conceptualization issue is a deeper one. It sounds like it's something of a problem of conceptualization, that the Western model of democracy is being imposed.
Yes.
And you think that in some sense it has to be modified on some fundamental level. It's not merely a problem of implementation, that the West should live up to its own ideals, but it's something more fundamental.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
I think that's what you're arguing as well. I just had another question about case selection. Mm-hmm. So it seems to me that the basic design is a bivariate design, as I've been trying to tease out the logic. Effectively, you're saying military intervention is negatively associated with state performance. in a sense that if you intervene militarily, that state performance actually is worse.
If it's prolonged.
Okay.
If military intervention is prolonged, when it fails to protect local communities, when it is not successful in restoring security, yes, it can complicate the conflict environment.
Okay, good. And I think that makes sense. And it seems to me that you demonstrate that with your cases. Is there any concern that you have, and this goes back to the issue of the kinds of avenues of attack one might put to the work, that there are other cases that would have disconfirmed your hypotheses and that leave you vulnerable in any way?
Well, I have demonstrated, I've selected cases where military intervention was successful, as in the case of Sierra Leone and Liberia. So, one could argue that it worked here, so, you're wrong, but I do quote the reasons why it worked. It was humanitarian, it was in combination with local conflict resolution and local and regional conflict resolution processes. It involved the mobilization of tremendous financial costs, and it was able to, initially it didn't work in both countries, but eventually it succeeded, and peacekeeping forces were able to help bring an end to the war, which is a critical indicator of success. So if military intervention is in response to violence and it is unable to bring an end to that violence, then clearly it's not working. And I think that should be a yardstick for evaluating for evaluating the viability of an intervention. If it goes on for a prolonged period of time and it is unable to bring an end to violence, then it is not successful.
Good. One last thing. One of the things that's suggested in the dissertation and not developed as much as it might be is the criticism of the Western security theoretical tradition and the idea that a Southern tradition would add something to that. What is the most important lesson you learned in your research about what that Southern tradition would contribute?
Well, first of all, the Southern tradition suggests that one should look at the specific context of the state rather than aggregation of states. And, these labels, the experts that I interviewed suggested that it's very important to look at each state comprehensively. Secondly, they favored conflict resolution processes far more than military intervention. So I think these two are very important perspectives.
That's all.
Thank you, Solon. Sarah, it's up to me. Bring up the rear. I was struck by the extent to which your findings are an affirmation of conflict resolution theory and practice, particularly the work of John Burton, a major pioneer in the development of the field. Some of us in the room are working on revisiting Burton's findings, Solon, Ingrid, Kevin, and some others, to see if he's still relevant. And your comments with regard to the power of basic human needs and the poverty of the prevailing traditional paradigm of political realism, so-called realism, and the fact that realism as a basis for policy is so self-defeating, struck me as I say, affirmation of much of his work, and the need for a paradigm shift from power politics thinking to a problem-solving approach are all sustained by your research findings. What I'm interested in, however, is why the United States and Britain and Australia and other major states persist in using power politics, so-called realism, as a basis for self-defeating policies that fail. And as an indicator of failure, this morning on NPR, I was awakened by the news that for years, millions of dollars are leaving Kabul airport in suitcases without being checked. Millions of dollars in aid money. And this has been going on since 2002. That's not an indicator of success, yet it's still happening. And as you mentioned, Obama has increased the use of drones in attacking targets in Pakistan eightfold over President George W. Bush. Has this led to any success in the war on terrorism? I don't think so. I think it's led to further radicalization amongst young Muslim males throughout the world. Why does the United States persist in doing this, do you think? What is it about us? I'm an American. What is it about American traditions, cultures, institutions, or indeed human nature that allows us to continue walking to the abyss? Why don't we move toward the conflict resolution paradigm, which seems to be so successful?
Well, I think it's a very difficult question you're posing, but I feel that the United States, in particular, being a military superpower, is more inclined to use military means to resolve its problems, because it really has not tried otherwise. To conflict resolution, I think it really calls for a paradigm shift, which hasn't happened. And some people argue that conflict resolution is the tool of the weak, don't they? So when you have power, you will use whatever means you have.
Even though it's not successful.
Even though...
Except in killing people.
Well, as I suggested, many in the United States in the policy world believe that the United States is safer as a result of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, that they're able to keep the Taliban and Al-Qaeda busy in those regions of the world, and they do believe that as a result there have been fewer terrorist attacks in the United States. Many of, and President Obama also has suggested in many of his speeches, and now Osama bin Laden has also been killed, that the global war on terrorism has made the United States more secure, even at the cost of the loss of hundreds of thousands of lives.
It depends upon how you frame safe. Years ago, it was being argued that American Muslims were not like Muslims in Europe. American Muslims were well integrated, they were professional, they earned higher than the national average, they were better educated, and therefore the phenomenon of the homegrown terrorists would not occur here as it was occurring in the Netherlands, Sweden, Britain, etc. In recent years, it's been occurring here. There haven't been many attacks, but there have been more arrests of people who are American citizens who seem to be planning attacks, which was not the case some years ago. So being safe may have to be redefined. It's a bit like we're not sure what a failed state is, we're not sure what safety is either. What would you recommend to President Obama, if you had the chance, that he should think about based upon your findings in American foreign policy?
With regards to the global war on terrorism, or in general?
State failure, terrorism.
State failure. Well, I would definitely, obviously, encourage him to engage in more dialogue with the Muslim world in particular, to involve leaders of other states, and particularly Islamic states and or states in states of strategic concern to the United States, in policy making that affects those countries, to develop and design policies that benefit all sides. To be, I would encourage President Obama to be more. He has been supporting in his speeches at least, the need for dialogue, the need for more engagement, but I find that he's not doing enough to bring about that change that he talked about. So he needs to actually walk his talk. He knows what to do, but I think it's very difficult for him. He wants to be re-elected, and he finds that if he does, if he brings about radical change in policy, engaging with failed states, a dialogue with Iran, dialogue with the Taliban, which is, underway, but it's all covert. They don't talk about it publicly. He needs to be more bold and be willing to take risks if he wants to bring about change.
Finally, as a citizen of Pakistan, what have you learned in your research about the resilience of Pakistan that you didn't know before you started to study, if anything?
About the I think that Pakistan is a resilient country. It has experienced a lot of turmoil through its history. It has also been dismembered. It has a very strong civil society, a lot of talent, but at the same time, I acknowledge that Pakistan is undergoing a mild type of decline. The levels of violence in Pakistan have never been higher. That Pakistan is in dire straits right now. It is under a lot of pressure because of the global war on terrorism. There are insurgencies going on in different regions. It has unresolved disputes with neighboring India. That said, Pakistan needs to make some serious and fundamental adjustments in its policies, especially in the social development sector. It needs to invest in human resources, contribute, help develop and contribute to the betterment of its people, empower the people. Unless it does so, Pakistan, I'm afraid, because of all the regional security dilemmas, the neighborhood warfare, problems with India, global war on terrorism, Pakistan could face, it could get worse, and so we do need. We need to get our house in order. So, perhaps I was more optimistic when I came here about Pakistan, but certainly Pakistan's condition has deteriorated. But I still believe that it's a very highly resilient country, that it is not at the brink of collapse. It is certainly not a failed state. It's certainly not more failed than Afghanistan or the Central African Republic or Sierra Leone. There's a lot going on in the country, and there's a lot to look forward to, but certainly things are not looking good right now. I hope that answers your question.
That's very good, thank you. Do we have any questions from our other PhD candidates? Eve Renee.
Thank you, Sarah, for sharing your dissertation findings with us. I have one question about your framework for analysis. You have there several critical components of state failures, and I am looking at, for instance, Haiti. It is among the countries on your list on the second page, and I would like to know how many of these components that one needs to consider if one carries out an analysis. Are you thinking about all of them or some of them? What would be the maximum that one needs to take into account?
Well, I think that when you're analyzing a country and if you want to label it failed, I think it's important, some of one or two components may be missing, but it should show more rather than fewer of these indicators. But as I said, state failure is a rare and uncommon phenomenon. And so you also want to analyze the problem of fragility and weakness, and you may find that some countries demonstrate, show some of these characteristics, but not all of them. And the fewer characteristics that they demonstrate, I guess you could say that, it's the situation is probably not as bad, but
Because I asked in the case of Haiti, I think all would pertain except the protracted conflict region, because Haiti is not in a region
Right.
that has protracted conflict. But when I look at hostile neighbors, we have the Dominican Republic.
right.
So that's why I ask.
Right. So yes, certainly Haiti is, I think, could be classified as a failed state. Its government is not able to provide minimal to carry out minimal functions even. So definitely, I think it classifies as a failed state. Yes, it doesn't have a hostile neighborhood. So that's a plus in favor of Haiti. So when a state is failed, it doesn't mean it cannot recover or that that there's no way out.
Thank you.
Hussein.
Thank you very much, Saira, for this wonderful dissertation here. And I just have a quick question. If you had to name at a time where intervention by international community was really essential, what category would you really use? That when you would say this is really legitimate international intervention.
Clearly, in many cases of humanitarian crises, such as the one in Rwanda, where the international community failed to intervene, and it was considered controversial, but I think it's very important for there to be a global consensus on intervention. And by a global consensus, I mean it should represent the voices of the global north and the south, different quarters. So it's really not up to me to decide when intervention is right or wrong, but the global community, and I think the UN system should be reformed to include, reformed in a manner that is more representative of the international community.
Thank you for your presentation. So you mentioned there's a couple of reasons why there's military intervention. There might be humanitarian issues, or the country might be doing something in self-defense or humanitarian causes. In your research, did you come across any instance where a country might do a military intervention purely for economic reasons or empire building reasons?
Can you please repeat the last part of your question?
In your research, have you come across any instances where a country might intervene militarily purely from an economic perspective or empire building?
Well, in the ongoing intervention in Libya, the intervention in Iraq, one could argue the ulterior motives were economic or corporate. There's, intervention in Libya is clearly, it appears that, there was no intervention in other Arab countries. Why Libya? Because of the oil. So yes, one could make the argument that very often the intervention is, the interest is driven by economic interests. And it's not just security interests.
Anybody else? Mohammed. Oh, okay.
Yeah, since you critique this Western model of the failed state index, and you are of course presenting a more cosmopolitan or a globalized alternative, what would be your approach to substituting the failed state index and promoting the new? I mean, how would it become part of the media discourse, the policy discourse, and so forth?
Well, there is a South Asian scholar by the name of Iqbal Ahmad who has provided a list of 7 categories showing a variety of or describing a variety of types of politics at play in different third world countries. And for instance, he says, there are elective parliamentary systems, there are radical nationalist systems such as in Algeria, there is neo-fascist systems such as Iran under the Shah, ascriptive palace systems such as in Morocco or Nepal when it was a monarchy. So, there's no alternative, but I think it's better to have more specific classifications that describe the context of the state rather than these blanket classifications that don't tell you a lot. And even Iqbal Ahmad suggests that these categories, they don't serve much of a function except to basically provide some kind of a comparison between different kinds of states and the kinds of politics, and to provide some kind of a framework to show political change within these systems. So I think these indices generally are not very helpful. And the alternative is just to look at each state and, as we do in conflict analysis, we look at the country, if we're examining the problem in the country, the parties, its conditions, and each country has its own development trajectory, its unique regional challenges, relations with neighbors. As Yves René pointed out, that Haiti doesn't have any hostile neighbors. So, so that's not a problem. I hope I'm answering your question, Mohammed.
Okay, yes.
Saira, thank you, and I'm very happy for you, my friend. You've mentioned in your case selection the 2 countries that you used as a control cases, Nepal and Algeria. I wanted to focus a little bit on Algeria, and I was wondering if you come through your research, but is there any strategic reasons why, international deployment force, weren't in Algeria? And also if you can put that in light of the Arab Spring, that of course we are seeing what's going on in in each country, but Algeria always is the opaque environment where you barely hear about, even though we know their violence is still there. We know what's going on inside, and probably what we hear in the media does not really portray what's really going on inside. So I was just wondering if you can elaborate a little bit on that. Thank you.
Yes. So in the case of Algeria, when the revolution was the Islamic Revolution was going on, I think since then, in particular, Algeria has become important strategically because of its the growing influence of Al-Qaeda. But at the time, while Algeria is an oil exporter, it wasn't very interesting to the rest of the world strategically. And any intervention does involve a lot of costs on the part of the interveners, and they do engage, I'm sure, in cost-benefit analysis, and where it seems that it's not in the interest of the country. And secondly, President Bouteflika was trying to crack down on Islamist fundamentalists. So the intervention, if the international community had intervened, maybe they would have done so to support him. But and the World Bank was providing a lot of funds to President Bouteflika at the time to fuel his confrontation with the Islamists. So they were indirectly engaged through financial support. And why they didn't intervene now, I would say again, it's a cost-benefit analysis. Algeria is generally perceived as a neutral country, still under the control of President Bouteflika. Libya, next door almost. In North Africa, you have Colonel Gaddafi, who's, it's seen as a rogue state. It challenges the West at several levels. So it's, the West has a stake. It has a strong interest in intervening. I hope that answers your question.
This will be the last question from the audience, then we'll come back to our panel.
Don't you think that I remember you said why you mentioned that you thought oh, actually I don't remember what you said, but you mentioned you talked about why the US did not want to move forward in the countries that they were, or any intervener, why they would not want to move forward from the point of just gunning down every civilian that seemed to be a threat to humanitarian and community building efforts. Don't you think that that's more of a matter of just pride on the part of the interveners, that they have already invested all this time and money and capital and lives into this project, and they don't want to go back and say, okay, we were wrong, this wasn't the right approach? Yeah.
So the question is, what you're basically saying is that the international community sometimes feels that it's not right to intervene, and it will not work, it will not help in a particular environment. Is that the question, if I understand it correctly?
No, it was more, you said that a lot of times what's necessary is not simply military intervention, like in the case of Afghanistan, for instance, and that there are other measures needed to solve the problem. And my question was, once countries have already gone a different path from that to begin with, because they didn't realize that that's what was necessary from the start, and they're not willing to get back onto that path, do you think that's just a matter of pride for the interveners?
I mean, it depends. I guess it would depend on the situation. Well, it's something I would need to look at. I haven't considered it in my dissertation, but it's a thought-provoking question. The question of pride. Yes, it's a good question.
Francis Fukuyama suggests that pride is a powerful variable in accounting for human behavior globally. My colleague, Monty, Solon, any follow-up questions?
I do, actually. One comment and one hopefully not too difficult question. As I'm listening to you speak and listening to the questions from the audience, I can't help but think about a book that was very influential when I was doing my own research by Stephen Cherover, called From Genesis to Genocide, in which he makes a very powerful argument that this mic is dying, it's falling on the table, I can't handle it anymore. That the worst possible outcomes are brought upon by the vain efforts of human beings to use their own advantages to try and engineer outcomes in their own image, so to speak. And in your argument, you say, well, it's the Western model, we're trying to impose the Western model, we're willing to use force to try and create states or to move states to adopt this Western model because the Western model is good. His argument is, well, the idea of trying to engineer an outcome that you're not directly involved in necessarily is what creates the tensions that lead to the opposite outcome. That you can't engineer from the center, that you have to include in your case, the South, and the voice of the South as to what they want, not what you think they need, or what they should want, but what they want now, and what they think they can do now. So to put this into a context, as Algeria was already brought up. The first hint of the Arab Spring is the exact same thing in Algeria that we see in Egypt, but it came at a different point in time. And it only came individually rather than in the context of multiple outbreaks of discontent. And so the threat was not perceived as strongly. It was Algeria. France was very influential. France did assist the Algerian government in putting down the Islamic Party. Yeah, the FSI, especially. I mean, that's the broad-based, popular discontent in Algeria. The Democrats, the ones who won the election, but were denied office. Next door we have Libya, and the real question is, well, we have Algeria, was left alone, seems to have sorted itself out, although with great effort and great effect. Egypt, on the other side, receives the same kind of support that Algeria receives, has a strong military, but at a different point in time takes a different tactic, at least so far. And so we don't see the violence so far in Egypt. But then we have Libya in between. We have an intervention. The argument is the intervention is the humanitarian motivation, the R2P. Number one, do you think that the R2P is being served by this military intervention? Was the intervention necessary to promote R2P? Has it been effective? And what do you see the net effect of this intervention to be in the long term?
If I may just quickly, R2P stands for Responsibility to Protect, which was instituted in 2005.
Well, as we are witnessing in Libya, the levels of violence, of course, have increased. The argument for R2P can be made. One can say that it was, and they have said it's a humanitarian intervention. But then, at the same time, it's very clear that the intervention is designed not just to protect local populations, but to empower the rebel parties and to topple Gaddafi. So it seems strategically motivated. It doesn't seem to be designed to bring about a problem-solving dialogue, political dialogue, a conflict resolution process to help the parties talk to each other. So from a Western perspective, yes, but I think many in the global South are questioning this intervention. It is not seen as a very transparent case of R2P. The net effect, it really depends on how long it goes on, and if it goes on for a long period of time, there will be more instability in the region. If it's as short-lived as Kosovo, it's already much longer. Such short interventions tend to be helpful. Can be more positive. They tend to be more productive, but it is likely to destabilize the region more. The way it's going on right now.
There's a certain measure of tautology there.
Mm-hmm.
If it's a short intervention, of course, it has less of an impact.
Mm-hmm.
How can we differentiate between a short and a long?
I think a short intervention, Patrick Reagan in his study in 1996 argues that an intervention should be conducted for a period of 6 months to test its success. If it's not able to bring an end to violence within 6 months and create the space for problem-solving dialogue and conflict resolution, then it should be revisited. So yes, that's a standard, that's set by Patrick Reagan in his empirical study of, I believe it's 96 cases of military intervention. So I think that would be a good way to say, well, okay, let's see how long this goes on. It hasn't been 6 months so far, but
Actually, it has, hasn't it? Because when the War Powers Act was in
March.
yeah, is that three months for the War Powers Act? 180 days.
So longer than 6 months, I think, is not advisable.
I think you have all been very, very patient, including Sarah. Thank you again very, very much. We, the committee, will now confer outside and come back to let you know where we stand, Sarah.
Thank you so much.
We should be back in 10, 15 minutes.